Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But before I talk about my amendment, I have to once again stress for anyone watching at home, what is happening in this Judiciary Committee is becoming a pattern and practice week after week after week, which is really the majority's effort to demonize immigrants as often as possible, to try to get Americans to come to be suspicious of immigrants, to loathe immigrants, to see immigrants as criminals. And I want to object to that repeated practice that we're seeing on judiciary. No doubt that we have a challenge and an opportunity in our country. The challenge is we have not created enough legal pathways, and so a large number of migrants are using the asylum system. But the opportunity that lies before us is that we should be reforming our outdated immigration laws, creating more legal pathways, because immigrants make America better and immigrants help grow our economy. Having said that, I do think it's always important to make sure that we have rule of law in our country. And I have to say, this bill is, as the ranking member said, overly broad. So my amendment seeks to try to address that. Under the current language of this legislation, any individual who entered without inspection, even if they later received deferred action for childhood arrivals or have DACA protections or temporary protected status, TPS, any individual who has those legal protections, who is merely arrested for or charged with any robbery offense, will be subjected to mandatory immigration detention. The bill does not have an exemption for someone who is arrested and then exonerated of a robbery offense. As such, even a longtime TPS or DACA recipient who is erroneously arrested for robbery and then released without charges could nevertheless be subjected to mandatory detention under this bill. This amendment would allow those folks some grace to ensure that longtime residents who have otherwise obeyed the laws, but for their manner of entering the United States, are not subject to mandatory detention under this law. Sadly, people are arrested for crimes they did not commit far more often than we would like to admit. Too often, those arrests are because someone has the same name as the alleged perpetrator, or they are misidentified, either by eyewitnesses or artificial intelligence. We see examples of this all the time. When discussing H.R. 6284, which we passed unanimously out of committee 2 weeks ago, Mr. Massey discussed the problems that communities of color in particular have with being punished for someone else's crime. He also discussed the need to ensure that there are no racial disparities in AI. Unfortunately, we've seen these problems come into play in the criminal justice space. The ranking member discussed some examples of people falsely arrested for robbery, but there are countless others. A man was arrested in New Jersey when a facial recognition system falsely identified him as someone who committed a robbery and tried to hit a police officer with his car when he made his escape. He spent 10 days in jail and $5,000 to defend himself, but it took 10 months for the case to be dismissed for lack of evidence. Now, if this individual was a DACA or TPS recipient, he would be subject to mandatory detention under this bill, even though he was wrongfully arrested and never committed a crime. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will accept this amendment so that we can fix this overly broad and punitive legislation. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida withdraws his point of order. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized to speak on the amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would exempt anyone in DACA or who's been given temporary protected status from the provisions of this bill. Well, this administration has been granting TPS status at an unprecedented rate. It is one of the ways that the Democrats are circumventing our immigration laws and releasing illegal immigrants into our communities with little or no vetting. And I must once again take exception to this proclivity by some of the Democrats on this committee. They love to lump legal immigrants who've obeyed all of our laws and done everything our country's asked of them to do with illegal immigrants whose very first act entering our country is to commit a federal crime by illegally crossing the border. By their own actions, they demonstrate a contempt for our laws, and they demonstrate their willingness to violate those laws.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
No, I won't. I'm making a statement. The current mandatory detention provisions that we have in law provide no, that are already in law, provide no exceptions for DACA or TPS granted individuals. So this amendment would actually broaden the applicability of our immigration laws beyond the current law. I would also point out, in response to this notion that somehow this is a recurring theme, I'll tell you what the recurring theme is. The recurring theme is Americans being victimized by this mass illegal migration. On Tuesday, a migrant was arrested for allegedly beating up a 50-year-old man with a rock and attempting to steal his wallet on a Brooklyn street. He was arrested after police responded to a robbery in progress in Greenpoint, according to the NYPD. A couple of weeks ago, 4 Venezuela migrants who've been in Chicago for as little as 1 month, 3 of whom were on pretrial release for retail theft. They lured a man to the back of a CTA train car and choked him into unconsciousness during a vicious robbery. These are the recurring acts that we are seeing as a result of the Democrats' open borders policy, and the American people have had enough of it. I just hope that they're watching these proceedings today and realize how the Democrats have not only unleashed the worst illegal mass migration in recorded history, but have defended it every day in this committee for the last 3 years. And now we're seeing the results of it in our communities. With that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yield for a question now?
Sure.
Gentleman yields to the gentleman from New York.
Thank you. You make a point that I disagree with, but I'm not going to argue it. But I will ask you this. You say that we're being victimized by people who entered this country illegally and they have no right to be here and so forth. DACA recipients who may have come to this country at the age of 2 months old or 2 years old, did not commit any crime by coming here. Maybe their parents did by bringing them here, but it wasn't their fault. Would you accept an amendment if it were just to exempt DACA recipients?
Well, the problem is those DACA recipients are now grown-ups, and the first thing we ask of grown-ups in our society is to obey our laws, including our immigration laws. The fact that they've been violating those laws during their entire lifetimes does not excuse them from that. I would suggest that perhaps we should invite them to return to their home countries and apply for admission the way millions of legal immigrants do every year, who obey our laws and respect our country's sovereignty.
People who know only the United States and regard it as their home country because they've been here since they were 2 months old.
Granted, that is an exception. I would have to agree with you on that point. However, if we allow such exceptions, we simply invite a new wave of illegal immigration, bringing new 2-month-olds into the country to acquire the same rights over time. That's the problem that we have in this discussion right now, Mr. Nadler. I mean, there are many of us who would like to address that issue that you raised, the 2-month-old who's brought into this country and has grown up here and knows no other. But we cannot address that until we have secured our borders and restored our immigration laws, because if we don't do that, we're simply inviting new waves, as this administration has over the past 3 years. So let us fix the problem, and then we can address the issue that you raise. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? The gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know you'll agree with me, Mr. Chairman, if I say that I wish these hearings were dedicated to our FISA reforms bill, where we had so much bipartisan support, and yet we can't get that bill to the floor, even though it passed with such tremendous support in our committee. So I wish we were discussing that. But
The gentlelady yield just a second.
I would,
I mean, maybe that's what we should do. Maybe we should have another hearing on FISA, even though the bill's been out of the committee. It was 35-2. Maybe we'll have another hearing on
I
FISA
think
just to highlight.
that would be such a good use of our time, and I would really advocate for that over these hearings, Mr.
Well,
Chairman.
I didn't mean in lieu of, I meant in addition to.
But I'm so glad that you're with me
Would
on
the
that.
gentlelady yield for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. I just want to point out to Mr. McClintock that the government is not accepting new DACA applications, so no new two-year-old or two-month-olds can enter under DACA. I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
Thank you. I didn't want to miss the fact that, Mr. Jordan was definitely agreeing with me that we should spend our time on things like FISA reform. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make a couple of comments. I want to, first of all, thank the gentlelady from Texas for her amendment. It is a smart, sane, humane amendment. It is absolutely the kind of thing that we should be doing because, frankly, this bill is overbroad. It is cruel. We had numerous discussions about this last week, so I'm not inclined to give my statement all over again. But Mr. McClintock had said that, he would like to see us go back to our restored immigration system. But the fact is, our immigration system has not been adjusted, modernized for 30 years. So what exactly are we going back to? When you talk about an immigration system that is so out of touch with the reality of where our country is, the workers that we need, the communities that need to be with their family members, the employers that are seeking to bring people in, there are so many ways in which we are working from numbers that are 30 years ago, even in terms of the population growth. And so I don't understand, if we want to secure the border, which we all want to do, if we want to make sure that our country has what we need to be humane, we have to fix the underlying system. Chaos at the border is related to chaos in our legal immigration system. If we could fix our legal immigration system so that we had enough immigration judges, so that we had enough asylum officers, but most of all, so that we actually had legal pathways so people could apply to come here, then I think we would be in a much better position. And as somebody who came here legally and waited 17 years to get my US citizenship and went through the process and multiple visas, I can say I don't actually think that many Republicans, I'm not impugning the motives of our immigration chair, but many Republicans did not want to encourage the legal immigration system. And I'll just give you one example. Here's an article from the Cato Institute, not necessarily a left-leaning institution, and the title is, President Trump Reduced Legal Immigration. He did not reduce illegal immigration. Under Donald Trump, he actually decimated the legal system and took away the ability for people to be able to come into the country through application, through different pathways that we have, whether it's for employment, whether it's for refugee asylum, all of those things. He undermined the legal immigration system. And what President Joe Biden has done is tried to restore some options that are available to restore that legal immigration system. But let me just remind the committee of what I said last week, a point that I do think is important to remind people of. Under Donald Trump, undocumented migration, unlawful migration across the border from February 1st of the year that Donald Trump came into office to December of the year that Donald Trump left office went up by over 300%. So let's not pretend that it worked somehow magically with the cruel things that Donald Trump did and the harsh enforcement policies, whether it was Remain in Mexico, whether it was family separation. Let's not pretend that those did anything to actually address the deficits of a legal immigration system that has been broken and left in time. It's almost like captured in time, like a fossil from 30 years ago with numbers that don't even reflect the needs of our country. And so I hope that we can address this issue in a comprehensive way, and I hope all of our colleagues will vote for my colleague from Texas's amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I oppose this amendment I want to remind everybody, what we're talking about is robbery.
Yeah.
If you commit a robbery, you're going to be detained. Doesn't matter whether you're DACA or not DACA, that's a serious crime. You're going to be detained. Now, when we hear stories like the ranking member was talking about, he said, what about the kid who was brought over when they're 2 months old? This is the only country they've known. Or 2 years old, or 12 years old, or 16 years and 6 months, or 17 years and 5 months. You cannot rationalize that away in that generic fashion, the way that the ranking member desires to. And then I want to point out to my colleague from Washington that the numbers that you referred to were almost all aggregated in 2019. And let's think about what happened in 2019. The policies that the Trump administration put in place had largely been enjoined by left-wing advocacy groups going to courts and having them enjoined. And what happened after they were enjoined? Ultimately, those injunctions were almost all universally set aside, and the courts upheld the legality and constitutionality of the Trump administration's efforts. And so what did you get? Well, in the Yuma sector, for instance, for the entire last year of Trump's administration, you had 8,600 encounters. 8,600 encounters for about 140 miles of linear miles of border. That went all the way, that sector goes all the way from Yuma and the border there all the way up to almost Las Vegas. That's considered the Yuma sector. 8,600 encounters. Do you know what Yuma gets now? About every 9 days they get 8,600 encounters. And you know what the Tucson sector gets? Well, since the last Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, you had 21,000 encounters across the entire southern border, more than 2,000 of those in the Tucson sector. And if you go to Lukeville, port of entry, you're going to see massive numbers virtually every day, usually 700 to 800. If you go to San Miguel Gate, which is on the Tohono O'odham Reservation, which has 62 linear miles of the border, you're going to also see about 600 to 1,000 people a day. That's what they're getting in the Tucson sector. And if you move over about 12 miles east of Sassabee, the Sassabee port of entry, you'll find a squatters camp sitting there on national forest land that some NGO without authority has come in, and they've basically denuded the trees from that forest and used those as firewood. There's no toilet facilities, so they've turned that, and they've dug a massive pit, and every day they're rolling 50 to 150 people through there, waiting for the CBP to come to pick them up and then take them to the soft-sided facility to process them and distribute them wherever they want to go in the country. The last point is, when you start talking about family separation, this administration, and this isn't me reporting this is the New York Times reporting this. Since the New York Times reported this, it's actually grown by about another 60,000 people. Initially, the New York Times reported that this administration has lost 85,000 plus children who came into this country illegally. They don't even know where they are. That number now is in excess of 140,000 people. So when you talk about family separation, that's what this Biden administration has done. And you will see, if you go to these soft-sided facilities, all of you talked about kids in cages and whatnot, go to the soft-sided facilities and see where they're having to try to keep these kids. Go to the hotels in places like Tucson. They don't have room for all the people at the soft-sided designated facilities, so they're renting hotels. Go there.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Happy to yield to a question.
Thank you.
That's twice I've yielded to you today, Mr. Nadler.
What?
That's twice today, brother.
Oh, very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
You said in an earlier part of your statement that if you commit a robbery, of course you should go to jail.
No, I didn't say that.
You said
I said you should be detained.
you should be detained. Okay.
Right. That's what I said.
If you commit a robbery, you should be detained.
That's right.
But, fine. The difference is that if you're accused of committing a robbery, or rather, you're not even arrested, you're not detained automatically. It's up to the judge. Under the terms of this bill, if you're, let's say, a DACA recipient who came here at 2 years old, and you're accused of a robbery, even though you're not arrested, you're mandatorily detained.
So I guess I'm out of time here, but I'm happy to inform the ranking member that I don't think he quite understands what an arrest is in American criminal law. But I'll yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield to the gentlelady from Texas, Rep. Escobar.
Thank you so much, Mr. Johnson. Just a couple things that I have to put out there in defense of my amendment. But first, before I get there, I think it is so important to acknowledge we all agree Congress should be doing, or at least those of us on this side of the aisle agree, Congress should be doing its job to address the increasing number of migrants arriving at our southern border. But the difference is that we are actually willing to work on solutions, whereas my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seek to obstruct those solutions. Just as a reminder for everyone, Congress has attempted to address our challenges at the border and also increase legal solutions multiple times over the last several years, actually 4 times in the last couple decades, 2006, 2014, 2018, 2024, this year. And what do all of those attempts share in common? Republicans derailed all of those efforts that would have both increased border security, but would have also opened up legal pathways. And in fact, the most recent effort, the effort this year by the Senate, a bill that was called by Republicans the toughest border bill ever, who obstructed that? It was Republicans who prevented that bill from coming to the House floor. They criticized it before the text was even out. And then they've gone on to misrepresent what was in the bill. And it really is remarkable. I am happy to work on solutions about the border every day of the week. I have filed a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform bill that I welcome my colleagues to join, that both secures the border and opens up legal pathways. But to the point made about my amendment, I want to again say that people who admit to or are convicted of serious robbery offenses are already subjected to mandatory detention under our laws. So this bill doesn't change that. What this bill does is increase the scope of who could be subject to mandatory detention, and it would strip people of their due process protections before being subjected to mandatory immigration detention and potential deportation. And even if it was proven that someone was arrested falsely, if they were a DACA recipient or a TPS recipient, they would still remain in mandatory detention. So this bill seeks to at least curb the incredible overreach and lack of due process for people. That should be a bare minimum in the United States of America. There should be no reason why anyone would oppose this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I yield back.
I yield back. I'll yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Jayapal.
Washington.
Washington, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to say that we have to correct some facts here. It is not true that Donald Trump's policies were enjoined in court. Remain in Mexico was in effect from January of 2019 until the end of Donald Trump's tenure. So those policies existed throughout. And I will just quote another article here, again from the Cato Institute, dated November 2nd, 2023. The title is, New Data Show Migrants Were More Likely to Be Released by Donald Trump Than Joe Biden. So we just have to be clear that, frankly, every president, Republican and Democrat has struggled because we have not passed comprehensive humane reform. And again, I want to make the point that when you have a legal immigration system that is so backlogged that people cannot even get their kids into the country before they turn 18, before they age into a different category, or you have employers who have people that they're ready to sponsor for jobs they need to fill, but you literally cannot get them in, or you have quotas for different kinds of workers in our country that are so outdated from 30 years ago, then the legal system has broken down. And what we have been saying for a very long time is we gotta make sure we fix the legal system, update it, modernize it, make sure it's got the resources to function properly, and then you will see that people use those legal pathways to actually get in. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I yield back.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I would yield my 5 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. So I want to talk about a couple things. Detention. The proposal of this amendment is tantamount, quite frankly, to cashless bail. That's really what this is about. And it's worked really well in places like New York, LA, San Francisco, Detroit, Philadelphia, or any other high crime jurisdiction, because that's really what's happening here. When the ranking member says it's up to a judge to determine whether someone's detained, actually it is initially and first determined by an officer whether you're going to issue a cite in lieu of detention, whether you're going to issue, whether you're going to actually take someone physically in custody, take them down to jail, and then the prosecutor's going to weigh in and determine whether they are going to take it to a grand jury, or they're going to do a long-form complaint. How are they going to actually process the arrest? And it is an arrest. What the underlying bill does, which is emasculated by the amendment, is it actually detains somebody who is in the country illegally. And it detains them and allows for essentially a hold on them until they have that issue resolved. Now, I will say this. When I'm told that Republicans are not wanting to solve this problem, I can't help but think of H.R. 2. H.R. 2, which has been languishing over in the Senate, which would solve a lot of the border issues that we have, border security issues that we have, but the Democrats chose not to vote for that. They don't like that. In fact, it was the Democrats who came out under this administration and said, we're not going to have a wall. They weren't going to have a wall till what? Till 85% of Americans said border security is a problem. Now, President Biden says, well, maybe we should build a wall. Secretary Mayorkas said, we're going to close the holes in the wall in the Yuma sector. He said, we will get that done within 12 months. And why did he say that? It's because in those holes, that's where a massive amount of people were coming and flooding through every day illegally. But did he do that? No, he didn't close those. He said he would, but he never did. How about this one? This administration is killed the Remain in Mexico policy, the MPP program. And one of my colleagues just across the aisle just said, well, that was in effect in 2019, January 2019. It was not in effect in 2019. It had been proposed and was being implemented, and it took time to get it implemented. This administration, however, shut it down on day one. This administration has proceeded to shut down through massive uses of executive orders anything and everything that might bring the border under control. So when my colleagues across the aisle say, we really want to we just like the Republicans want to bring this under control, that Title VIII allows this administration to actually bring the border under control and close it if the president deems it necessary. Title VIII has never been changed. What has changed is the will to enforce the law, and this administration doesn't have that will. And I would just tell you, I do think it's interesting that the Cato Institute is referred to. The Cato Institute is not a conservative organization. It is an open borders organization in part. That's their gig. And how do I know it? Because we've had Cato Institute here and in oversight committees sit there. They're not conservative, they're libertarians. Get a grip. And what does a true libertarian say? A true libertarian says, hey, no borders. That's what a libertarian says. And that's what they say. And I'd ask you to go watch the Libertarian Cato Institute's testimony in oversight. They were lots of fun, and they would confirm to you they were open border. And I'm pleased to see that my colleague across the aisle is consistently relying on an open borders organization because it's consistent with their position on let's not do anything to really secure the border. Let's go with that 5,000 a day with the exceptions that the Senate was putting out. That's what's laughable. Yield back.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield to the gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I wanted to enter into the record this article that says Trump's claims of a migrant crime wave are not supported by national data. Ask unanimous consent to enter that into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Thank you. And then I wanted to just read, because my colleague across the aisle cited all these cities, and how are things working out for these cities. And I just wanted to read from this, an NBC News review of available 2024 crime data from the cities targeted by Texas Operation Lone Star, which buses or flies migrants from the border to major cities in the interior, shows overall crime levels dropping in those cities that have received the most migrants. Overall crime is down year over year in Philadelphia, Chicago, Denver, New York, and Los Angeles. And so these are the same cities that my colleague across the aisle just named, and I just wanted to say that actually it's working pretty well. You asked how it was going pretty well in those cities in terms of crime reduction. But look, I want to go back to this point of making sure that we are talking about this in a way that is reflective of the challenges. You know, in the last hearing that we had on these bills, Mr. Massey on a different bill discussed the real concerns about racial disparities and the development of artificial intelligence and facial recognition tools, and we all agreed with that. And that same concern comes in here. In a particularly egregious case, a Detroit woman was arrested for robbery and carjacking after she was improperly identified by an automatic facial recognition search. At the time of her arrest, she was 8 months pregnant. The police handcuffed her in front of her crying daughters and fiancé and held her for 11 hours before she was released on a $100,000 bond. Prosecutors did not dismiss the case against her for another month. So I think we have to look at what happens when someone is arrested, charged, not convicted, has not gone through due process, but is subject to mandatory detention. And I think that is a huge overreach, and it causes enormous problems in terms of the data that is out there about how these arrests occur, particularly, you know, in a lot of circumstances, but certainly in terms of facial recognition tools is one example. So again, I would support the gentlelady's amendment, gentlelady from Texas's amendment, and ask that we restore some due process to this situation. I yield back to the gentleman.
And I'd like to yield additional time to the gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you so much. Wanted to correct the record because, again, it's remarkable to me the lack of reverence for facts from the other side of the aisle. My colleague said the president eliminated Remain in Mexico on day one. No, not true. It actually remained in place for over a year. And the country of Mexico is absolutely unwilling to restart Remain in Mexico. And in fact, my Republican colleagues' landmark bill, H.R. 2, which they love to talk about, is fundamentally rooted in the false notion that Mexico will accept every single migrant that the country of the United States sends back to Mexico. Not going to happen, has never happened, won't happen. The other falsehood that the president could use Title VIII but does not, Title VIII is in place in El Paso, is used every day. Every single day, Border Patrol uses Title VIII in El Paso. But here's the additional, just what the public should be aware of. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle love to complain about what the president is not doing. Just remember, they refused to give the president the resources he asked for the Department of Homeland Security. They refused to fund the president's supplemental for the Department of Homeland Security. And they are trying to make deep cuts to the budget. So, you know, everything really needs to be fact-checked over and over and over again. I'm glad to do it. And finally, this issue of the 5,000 people per day in the Senate bill, it was not 5,000 people released into the country. It was 5,000 people apprehended. So just a little fact check. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
The problem with my colleague's debate is after these people are apprehended, they are paroled into the country. And so, yes, indeed, it's 5,000 people that we would allow to be apprehended, paroled throughout the United States, and that's where you are seeing this wave of migrant crime. That's where you are seeing jurisdictions like New York City think about their sanctuary status. I mean, I recall vividly a few things. I recall at the presidential debate when the question was asked, who would provide free health care to illegal aliens coming into the country? We all saw President Biden raise his hand. He was a candidate then, but that is a pull factor. When you tell desperate people that you're going to give them benefits and you're going to give them cash and you're going to give them shelter and you're going to give them food, I don't particularly blame the illegal aliens who are crossing the border to get those things. I blame the choices we've made in government to allow it. And the underlying legislation here at least says, I don't know if you're arrested for robbery, that there is detention and then there is deportation, that we don't have to invite all of the third world's prisons across our border into our nation and then allow the people in this country to be victims of that crime that occurs. I also vividly remember Secretary Mayorkas sitting right here in this committee room acknowledging that these people who are being paroled out into the country would indeed commit crimes. And the victims of those crimes have to be the collateral damage so that the Biden administration can allow the border to go unchecked, to go uncontrolled. And as we now try to create some deterrent to that illegal entry, it's interesting to hear my Democrat colleagues talk about just the need for more resources. Oh, if we just gave the Biden administration and Mr. Mayorkas more money, that would solve this problem. They are lawless in their use of the money they already have. They are taking what has already been authorized and appropriated it, and they have used it to disperse illegal aliens into these sanctuary jurisdictions all over the nation. And so giving them more money is sort of like saying if you have a busted fire hydrant, you can solve the problem with buckets. You indeed cannot. You have to shut off the flow. You have to shut off the flow of the people into this country. And this legislation has the very humble objective of ensuring that people who commit robbery do not stay here to do additional grave harm to our fellow Americans. I'll yield my remaining time to the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to actually submit a couple of articles. One is called Chicago City Council Votes Against Measure to Ask Voters About Sanctuary City Status. Now, why is that important?
Without objection.
Because, thank you. It's because what was Chicago's concern? What is their current mayor's concern? At issue is how to continue financing shelter and other essentials for more than 20,000 migrants that have arrived in the city in the last 14 months. That's illegal migrants. I think it's absolute, quote, here's a quote here. I think it's absolutely imperative we give voters the opportunity to have their view on this subject heard, especially when we're talking about spending $255 million this year alone to take care of 20,000 migrants, Lopez said. So it's not really working out real well for Chicago. In New York City, you got Mayor Adams, who's also beefed about the sanctuary city policy. But why is this? Is it just because of sanctuary city? No, it's not about the sanctuary city. And he goes through and he clarifies that. This is what it's about. It's about all of the illegal aliens who have come to New York City, and that they're trying to deal with that. So let's just read a little bit from this article. This is a New York City article, Mr. Chairman, from ABC News. I'd like to admit
Without
that.
objection.
Thank you. After a series of, quote, well-publicized crimes allegedly committed by migrants, Mayor Eric Adams appeared to support a modification of laws that make New York a sanctuary city. He said on Tuesday that migrants who commit serious crimes should be deported, and the city should be able to communicate with federal ICE agents. Quote, "We should not be allowing people who are repeatedly committing crimes to remain here, and we cannot collaborate with ICE in the process," close quote. Another quote, "If you commit a felony, a violent act, we should be able to turn you over to ICE and have you deported," close quote. That's not really working out real well for New York City and Chicago, is it? You got people committing serious crimes, and now we have people kind of implying robbery ain't that serious. Yeah. The implication of what you're saying is robbery's not that serious. We don't think you should be detained. We don't think you should be prosecuted in this sense. In fact, we want to do something that is tantamount. It is tacitly like, it is a metaphor. It is similar. It is almost exactly like the cashless bail system, which is not working out real well for New York and Chicago. That I'll yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to the amendment sponsor, the gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ross. Did you all just hear that? Quote, Democrats don't think anyone who commits robbery should be detained or prosecuted. Did you ever hear anybody on this side of the aisle say that? No, you didn't. This is part of the problem. They say whatever they want. There's no respect for truth or facts. Going back to the issue of the Senate bill and that whole 5,000 person myth, one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and these are their excuses for not supporting what Republicans have called the toughest border bill in history, the claim was that the 5,000 people detained under the Senate bill would be paroled. No, they wouldn't. They would not. So this tells me either they did not read the Senate bill or they don't care about truth. In fact, when you read the bill actually ends, quote unquote, catch and release, which is a term that they use. So would highly recommend that folks on the other side of the aisle actually read the bills that they are railing against and stop making things up. Also, just fun fact, guess who used parole to great lengths? Their hero, former President Donald Trump. But back to the amendment and what we're talking about. I will again repeat for my colleagues, people who admit to or are convicted of serious robbery offenses are already subject to mandatory detention under our laws. Amen. This bill would not change that. What this bill does is increase the scope of who could be subject to mandatory detention and strip people of their due process protections. And remember, even if you've been falsely accused, even if there's evidence that someone else committed the crime you're accused of, under this bill, and you're an immigrant, you would still be detained in mandatory detention. This amendment simply seeks to put some guardrails into what is an incredibly overly broad bill. Interesting that they are fighting that. Thank you so much, Ms. Ross. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I think Americans need to wake up. The ranking member on the Immigration Subcommittee just told us this is all working out just fine. It's all working out just fine. I wonder how many Americans actually share this belief. I think perhaps we should put that to a vote. And fortunately, we will have that opportunity in a few months. Now, we were just told by the Democrats that, well, Donald Trump didn't reduce illegal immigration, only the options available to immigrants. Well, this is absolutely absurd. In fact, the Immigration Subcommittee was going to hold a hearing tomorrow in which we'll receive testimony from officials who've served both the Trump and Biden administrations about the explosion of illegal immigrants allowed into our country and what Biden did to produce this crisis. Donald Trump enforced our immigration laws. Those laws require asylum claims to be vetted. Under Biden, very few actually have credible fear interviews. Instead, they're simply admitted into the country. These laws require those who pass the credible fear test to be detained. Trump detained them or required them to wait in Mexico or a safe third country. Biden is ignoring that law and is releasing them into the country. Trump did everything he could to enforce our immigration laws. Biden has done everything he can not to enforce them. And without enforcement, we have no immigration laws. Without immigration laws, we have no borders. And without borders, we cease to be a country. And that is what is happening. And it's going to continue to happen as long as this administration remains in office. We're now talking about an illegal population, people who have no legal right to be here, deliberately released into our country in just 3 years. And between releases and gotaways, that population is now exceeding the size of the entire state of Missouri, our 18th largest state with 8 congressional districts. That's what's happened to our country in 3 years. An entire state of Missouri has been added to our population. But let's not lose sight of what this bill says. It says if you're here illegally, the law already requires you to be detained. The Democrats simply refuse to enforce that law. And this bill says if you're arrested for a robbery and here illegally, you really need to be detained. Let me repeat, the law already requires every illegal immigrant to be detained. This simply says if you're a robbery suspect, you're required to be detained. We have provisions of law right now, and have had it for decades, that require mandatory detention for aliens accused of crimes such as those involving moral turpitude, for committing drug offenses. This bill simply adds robbery to these provisions. Now, the Democrats oppose this measure. I think that speaks for itself. They believe that our immigration laws should not be enforced, and those who are here illegally and who are arrested for robbery, they should still be on our streets. And we're watching across the country the effect of these policies, and I think the American people are finally getting enough of it and are starting to wake up to the danger that has been created. And I thank the gentleman for yielding and yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. Any further members seek recognition? Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't know where to begin. I almost don't know what to say. So let's think of some of the statements that were made on the other side, supposedly factual statements. Our cities are safer now because our borders are open. That was one of the statements, basically. That we're safer now, that we have statistics, that the crime...
Would the gentleman yield?
I will not yield. I need my time.
Nobody said that, to be very clear.
I need my time. Yes, it was stated that the crime rate has gone down because of the open borders. Let's be serious in what was said. It did. We can review the recordings of it. Open borders don't make us safer. Your own FBI director, the FBI director said we're in a clear and present danger because we don't know all of the individuals who are coming into this country. And maybe crime rates can be adjusted too because we're letting people go the next day. We're changing because of very left-wing activists, prosecutors, and attorneys generals. We're changing felonies to misdemeanors. But if we want to say that and we believe that, maybe we should speak to the family of Lincoln Riley, to her family in what happened to her in Florida where she was beaten and murdered. Maybe we should speak to the Washington State Trooper over the weekend and his vehicle was crashed into by illegals and he was killed. And both of these had priors. They had committed acts before but were released. Maybe we should talk to the families of the NYPD officers that were beaten overwhelmingly because they had about a dozen illegals around them and they had no recourse. Maybe we should talk to the people in New York and in other cities whose school children are being removed from schools because their illegals are being temporary housing into where they are. Maybe we should talk to the people that live around tent cities that have cropped up across the country. Maybe we should talk to the people in my district when they were told that there might be as many as 60,000 illegals going into the Atlantic City airport because they didn't know what to do with them. Come on, we're denying common sense. Things have gotten worse.
Chairman, can we have order in the chamber?
Things have gotten worse. Everybody knows it. Every resident of this country, every citizen of the country feels it. Regardless of how much we talked about it, we can't make people believe that isn't something that isn't true. It is true. It is a problem. It's a real big problem. It's true that illegals were wearing Biden t-shirts at the border as soon as he got elected to be the president of the United States. It is true that Biden repealed all of the actions taken by President Trump and changed the entire dynamic at the border. We feel it, we see it, we hear it. America hears it, and regardless of how good you tell us it is, and how wonderful it all is, and how great it all is, people don't believe it. And the Senate bill, a few Republicans in the Senate said this bill was good. They couldn't even get the bill across the finish line because it was so bad, because it would use amnesty as a tool to allow these individuals to get into the country. And there was discussion that they would be giving apps on their phones so they knew where they were, or devices. Come on. It didn't have the stay in Mexico policy. And you know what? You know what would happen with a real president? You go to Mexico, you talk to them the way it happened in the past and say, if you don't straighten this out, because Mexico doesn't want them, because Mexico has borders, better borders than we do, you go to Mexico and say, they're gonna stay in Mexico, or you're gonna send them back, or you're gonna have some tariffs or taxes that you're not gonna believe. So we still do, in that Senate bill, in actual fundamental truth, would have catch and release. If we don't have Title 42 anymore, that was allowed to expire. We're not finishing building the wall anymore. That wasn't done. The Senate bill stunk. It wasn't good. Tell the people the truth. It was something to make us feel good, to pretend that we did something, but we didn't. That's why Republicans in the House of Representatives opposed it, and plenty of Senate Republicans did as well. So the bottom line is, there's a real problem here, and we're trying to deal with it as best we can. Unfortunately, our president currently does not. He could put executive actions in place today and change all of it, but he will not. So here we are, trying to hobble together the best that we can in different pieces of legislation to try to stop the bleeding. Let's tell the truth. I yield back.
Expired. Any further members seek recognition? Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you so much. I'd like to yield my time to my colleague from Texas to oppose all of these alternative facts that we continue to hear. And I think the real problem that's posed right here today is that my Republican colleagues continue to give misinformation. And I'd really love to hear from our colleague from Texas who lives there daily, who has been engaged in this fight ever since we've been in Congress. And she is highly respected and revered for understanding the true depth of what's happening at the border. And I think that we need to once again let her be given the time and effort to dispel the alternative facts, and I yield to.
Thank you, Ms. McBath. You know, we have members of the audience sitting in this hearing, and I hope you're seeing what is actually unfolding here before you. We had a Republican colleague just now claim that on this side of the aisle we said that well, I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically that we said things are safer because of an open border. I don't think you've heard any single one of us, especially during this hearing, say at any time the word open border. Never said that. We could rewind the tape and you would not hear that. But that's part of the challenge that we face today. And it's part of the challenge really that we face in this Congress. There are serious people wanting to solve some of our serious challenges. It is very hard when there are folks on the other side of the aisle who refuse to even tell the truth. Going back again, I can't believe I keep having to fact check on the Senate bill, but I think it's important because it provides an example of the lengths that some will go to basically deny the truth. The Senate bill, again, which was called one of the harshest border bills in history, not by Democrats. It was Republicans who called this Senate border bill the toughest bill on the border ever. One of our colleagues just said that it created amnesty. No, I mean, that's part of why you heard us laughing. No, like, it couldn't even be further from the truth. In fact, many Democrats were upset because it offered no legal pathways. It was all enforcement. The other thing that my colleague on the other side of the aisle said was the Senate bill failed because it was bad. They started criticizing it before the text was out, before the text was even published. And they did it because former President Donald Trump told them to. So they followed orders, and they were loyalists because Donald Trump said, I want the problem, not a solution. And they said, okay, we're with you. And week after week, we hear lie after lie after lie. Hard to solve big challenges when that's the way that Congress works for half of the Congress. I'm going to yield back to Ms. McBath, and hopefully there's some time for my colleague.
I yield the rest of my time to my colleague, Pramila Jayapal.
Thank you. I just wanted to make the case, rewind the tape here. One of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle said, cashless bail is the reason all these cities have so much crime, and then read through a list of cities and said, how did that all go for you? So I responded to that question. It had nothing to do with open borders. I talked about the cities that he mentioned and said, actually, crime is lower in those cities. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record another article called Migrant Crime Wave Not Supported by Data Despite High-Profile Cases.
Without objection.
Thank you. And then I would just like to say that my colleague from Mr. McClintock said, actually made the case that I think is important to the detail of the bill, the policy of the bill, which is that the Immigration and Nationality Act has impossible requirements that no administration has ever been able to meet. No Congress has ever appropriated sufficient funds to detain everyone listed in the current mandatory detention categories. And my colleague said there are all these other categories, and robbery is part of them. Convictions with robbery is part of them. And despite that, my Republican colleagues want to expand mandatory detention for those who are only arrested or charged. And so it makes absolutely no sense when we're already not able to detain people. That's under Donald Trump, it's under Joe Biden, it's under whatever Republican or Democratic president is in place. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. What we're not talking about, and what the President of the United States tomorrow night in the House chamber will not talk about, is Laken Riley, or Kayla Hamilton, or Aiden Clark, or Elizabeth Medina, a Texan I would note, or Jeremy Pau Caceres, forgive if that's not the correct pronunciation, who was a 2-year-old who was killed right here in Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside of the District of Columbia. My colleagues will not be talking about these individuals. The President of the United States will not be talking about these individuals. We have the former press secretary of the White House under President Biden, who's on MSNBC with a bunch of, I'll just call them left-leaning journalists, mocking and laughing at the Commonwealth of Virginia for their concern about the impacts of illegal aliens on their communities. The reality is there are significant concerns and the impacts of illegal aliens on the communities that we represent. That's the truth. My Democratic colleagues don't want to talk about that. They want to hide behind a Senate bill that had no chance, zero, of passage, was purposely constructed to give cover for those who know full well, because the American people are very clearly seeing it with their eyes, that this administration is purposely failing to secure the border of the United States. With Democrats like Mark Elias, who is out there doing what? Challenging laws in Arizona to make it not possible for those who are here illegally to vote. Now, why would he do that? Why do you suppose he would do that? I don't know. Got some thoughts on that. I think it's pretty self-evident. The fact is, what we have here is a bill in the Senate that would not have addressed the parole issue, would not have addressed catch and release, and in fact would have codified catch and release, not actually dealt with the issues that are problematic under the Flores settlement, which was what we used to talk about when we talked about catch and release. Now catch and release is just basically another way of saying mass releases. We would have exempted UACs under the Senate bill. The fact is they would have alternatives to detention under the catch and release program, which would have been codified, which basically means you're just codifying releases. We all know that. We all knew that when my colleague says, oh, well, you were against the bill before it got released. Because I don't know, we can actually capable of talking to our colleagues on the other side of the building, know what was going to be in the bill, and then oppose what we knew what was coming out. Just like I could oppose the appropriations bills before the final product is done, because I don't know, I've been in this godforsaken town long enough to know that I'm going to get a bill that, as the bill we're voting on this week, busts the caps, spends more money, increases interest, increases spending, doesn't actually make any of the policy changes we promised. That's the town. You can actually oppose it beforehand with almost 100% degree certainty when you know exactly what's coming out through the system. And the system in this bill, which was very clear from all the signals being sent by the usual suspects, including the Chamber of Commerce Republicans, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are alluding to, who were praising the bill, the same Republicans who have been complicit for several decades in allowing a border situation to get to the situation where we have thousands of Texans who are getting impacted by what's actually happening. The ranchers who find dead bodies, who find migrants sitting along the Rio Grande, they're all sitting there, they're calling me today, dealing with those bodies as we speak. The Texas reality of 299,000 over the last roughly decade, people incarcerated in Texas jails, classified as illegal aliens. Of those numbers, there were 719,000 criminal offenses. 719,000 criminal offenses in the state of Texas. 732 homicides, 34,569 assaults, 10,198 burglaries, 40,963 drug-related crimes, 462 kidnappings, 26,991 thefts, 26,991 obstruction of police, 2,759 robberies, 4,483 sexual assaults, 5,003 sexual offenses, and 4,167 weapon convictions. That's not trivial. Those are real crimes throughout the state of Texas that people are dealing with. All of those were documented under the statistics in Texas for DPS as the crimes committed by illegal aliens in the state of Texas. And those numbers have done nothing but go up under this administration. The legislation before us attempts to address one aspect of that, robbery and those kind of related crimes, not unlike the bill that we have on the floor, the Lake and Riley Act. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back for purpose. Gentleman from California, seek recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Have you all lost your minds? You are talking about a bill that your side wrote. This was your bill. James Lankford is the second most conservative member of the Senate. The second most conservative member of the Senate. This is your guy. He wrote the bill. He wrote the toughest border security bill that has come out of the Senate. And President Biden engaged with him, with other Democrats, to find a solution. Because they're in the solutions business. And you're in the chaos business. So let me bring everybody back to reality and give you a little history lesson. The reason you oppose the bill is not because you have any policy issues with it. It addresses everything that you've been talking about for the last couple of years. Because all I have heard from any of you is noun, verb, border. Noun, verb, border. That's all you know. And then you get a border bill from the second most conservative member of the Senate, and let me tell you why you oppose it. You oppose it because Donald Trump opposes it. That's it. That is the simplest explanation. Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is the correct one. Donald Trump opposes it because Donald Trump wants to be president, because Donald Trump has 91 felony counts that he's facing, and the only way that those go away and he is not held accountable is if he's president. And if the noun-verb border plan is no longer working and he can't use that as an issue, then he may not be president. So he says, I don't support this. I want the issue, not the solution. And so you all, God, I don't know what it feels like to be so helpless to have to follow somebody like Donald Trump. Follow Donald Trump. And it's fine, I get it. You must see yourselves as so very tiny and so very small when you look at Donald Trump, and he's so big that he looms so large over you that you would do anything that he says to support him. But that is the reality. This is not a policy dispute. Donald Trump wants the border issue, and so you're going to go along with Donald Trump. That's it. Welcome back to reality. And I yield to Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Mr. Swalwell. Again, speaking to folks watching at home and speaking to those of you in the audience, I said at the very top of this hearing, we would love to address the challenges we face. I represent a wonderful border community of goodwill that would like to see Congress act, would like to see Congress actually come forward with solutions. I've introduced a bipartisan solution that no one on this dais is remotely interested in. Fine. So what do instead? Again, they demand border security. The Senate delivers. And in fact, most Democrats were saying, oh my God, that bill gives Democrats no wins. It's everything Republicans have asked for. But as Mr. Swalwell mentioned, Donald Trump told them, don't touch it, so they make things up about it. But really, to today's point, what everyone has witnessed, what my Republican colleagues are trying to do, not address some of the big challenges we face, instead, again, use a hearing, use a markup to demonize immigrants. All right, we're gonna talk about robbery and immigrants. All right, a wild expansion of who can be detained. All of this time, we've been debating an amendment to try to create guardrails so that it's not this absolute dismissal of due process. Have you heard any of them debate the amendment? No, they're not even remotely interested. They stick to their talking points, which is demonize immigrants, demonize the border, and actually don't try to solve anything in any meaningful way. That is why Congress is broken. Thank you so much, Mr. Swalwell. I yield back.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Texas, who just won yesterday. Congratulations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I thought you were going to give me a day.
Yeah.
But thank you. And thank you, Ranking Member Nadler, for this morning. Let me rise to support the gentlelady from Texas amendment, because sometimes DACA status and TPS status are the only things our immigrants who are desperately trying to seek a legal status or a full, complete legal status, that's all they have. And if anybody wants to know, I'm in love with DACA. We fought for the early years to help those thousands that we found and discovered across America that have been brought into this country through no fault of their own. That is the language we designed by their families as infants, as toddlers, as 5-year-olds, as children. And then they have, most DACA you will find, have sought higher education. They are professionals. They have been firefighters, police officers, paramedics, because they're allowed. I know there was a period of time during the midst of the Iraq War and the Afghan War that individuals who had a, how should I say, a temporary status were entering the United States military in combat. Those individuals were hoping that their family members, even if they did not survive, would be able to gain the ability to stay in this country. To have this law apply to those who seek status We're not saying if you are a robber and you have robbed that you are not going through the judicial system, convicted, and that you do whatever is done to any one of us who is a proven robber. But it does not make sense to categorize the DACA, categorize the TPS, people who are seeking status, and have them to be detained because they're arrested, they're charged, and they're not convicted. Excuse my voice is certainly raspy. I will say that my soul is certainly still very strong. And so I am aghast that we have come to this point and that we're doing this piecemeal. The gentlelady from Texas is just trying to give relief to people that we see every day in our constituency, the kind of relief that would have gone about if we had voted on the compromise proposal or debated it at least, or gone to the floor. I want to pay tribute to the senator from Oklahoma who has been literally banned. He served with us in the House, one of the most conservative members of the Senate, who put forward a compromise that would have answered the questions that this piecemeal legislation seems to try and do. None of us are arguing for the freedom of a broken criminal justice system or the freedom of those who have done wrong. And that's how you want to paint us. There's that liberal lefties over here wanting to take the key of the jailhouse and throw everybody out. That is not true. Our families are victims of crime, but I always tell my constituents, I can walk and chew gum at the same time. I can fight for law enforcement. We're not defund queens that people wish to describe us, and those who seek to be fair with funding issues, but we believe in criminal justice reform. And so, likewise, on immigration, we're not here to promote, throw the key away, but I've seen the DACA family members. I've seen the TPS status members, and they are joyous members of this community, and you are punishing them by categorizing them. They too can be detained by simply being arrested, maybe charged, and not convicted. And that is simply to feed to the hysteria, the fear, the stigma, and the campaign promise of running on this issue in November. My friends are on the other side of the aisle. The chairman is my friend. Let's do a better job and really focus on comprehensive immigration reform. I support the gentlelady's amendment because it is a decent thing to do. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The question now occurs on the amendment from the gentlelady from Texas. All those in favor say yes. Aye. Or aye, excuse me. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The ranking member requesting roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.